Okay, and so the next four books are all nonfiction, and I'm not going to linger on these for too long. Let me see, let me get these sorted into, I'll put these in order as much as I can. So the first one I read was You Got Nothing Coming by Jimmy Lerner, and this is his story of he killed somebody in what he says was justifiable self-defense. He calls him the monster. And we meet Jimmy while he is in an isolation cell in a Nevada jail, and he's about to be transferred to a prison in Nevada. And he has been alone for quite some time. He's been convicted of, I want to say it was like manslaughter. And so we go with Jimmy. He is like 40, his late 40s. He's college educated. He has been working at a phone company in like the administration, like all this bureaucracy. And so he is completely foreign to this environment. He's never been arrested before. He's never been to anything like that. He's never really committed a crime before, except for uh, smoking pot in the 70s. This is from the 99 or 2000. So he gets lucky in a way because he has to go to prison in the clothes that he wore into jail or into whatever. And he was, or what he wore at trial. I'm not exactly sure. So he was wearing a suit and tie, and they didn't give him his tie, but he had his suit and his shoes and everything. And he comes out and he has to sit with these other guys, and they're not really paying attention to him because he's just some old guy. And he's sitting there listening to them talk, and there's all this slang that he doesn't understand. And he's sitting next to this guy, and he's called Kansas. And Kansas is from Kansas. Imagine that. And they start to kind of tease Jimmy a little bit. They start calling him OG because of his suit. I can't remember if they were calling him, if, you know, uh, original gangster, but I think they were calling him old gangster. So they started calling him OG, and he makes friends with these guys, and he winds up in prison and living in a cell with Kansas, who turns out to be like a neo-Nazi shot caller, and so he makes friends with Kansas, and it's kind of odd because I mean you expect him to be like um, a really bad guy, like a really dislikable guy, but um, he's not even like a super racist or anything. It's just the gang he joined, and like Jimmy is Jewish, by the way, and he has to keep that to himself. Um, so he's living with somebody who might kill him. But they develop this respect for one another, and Jimmy's trying to stay alive, so he does what he has to do to stay alive and to get through these. I think he's got like a 10-year sentence or a 15-year sentence. I think he got two sentences back to back. And so I actually quit reading this about 50 pages in or so, and it was just because of the slang. There's a lot of nah saying and stuff like that. It just over and over this repetition. But he was doing that on purpose to show kind of his bewilderment in being in this situation of not knowing what people are talking about and finding them kind of. He goes into it with a very white collar superiority, and he kind of sticks with that the whole time because he can see why these people keep coming back to prison and why they're in the circumstances they are. And he knows that no matter what he says to them, they're not going to change. And he starts working out. He starts getting jobs in the prison. Like his first job is working in the kitchen. And then they have him doing a little bit of legal work. Not really legal work, but it's more of like advising people of their rights. And he does really just all these things he can to get out of prison faster, to get a better cell, to just to stay out of trouble. And so he's witness to awful things, like really, really bad things that are happening, and abuses, both abuses of prisoners on other prisoners, but also guards, and then also how guards are kind of adopting the speech patterns of the prisoners, and even, being involved in their scams and their smuggling and that sort of thing. So and we learn about what got Jimmy in prison. He met somebody at an AA meeting. Jimmy had been an alcoholic, and he actually lost his family because he was an alcoholic. His wife divorced him, and he had to get into an apartment. But he meets a guy at AA, and this guy turns out to be a completely chaotic narcissist who just uses everybody around him, and it culminated in a violent attack where Jimmy had, this is according to Jimmy, by the way, which take everything with a grain of salt, but Jimmy was going to be killed by this other man in a hotel room in Las Vegas, and he defended himself and wound up killing the man, not really on purpose, but just in the course of this fight. And he did some really stupid things after that, like he took a bath before he called the police. So it is called into question really about Jimmy's reliability on that. But it was pretty good, and it wasn't great or anything, but it was interesting. I can't read any excerpts from it because it's just completely laden with like cursing and everything. And I just don't want to drop a lot of F-bombs today. And the next book I read was The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James D. Hornfischer. This is really, really good. This is about the Battle off Samar during or I think it's the day after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So when the Americans were coming back to Japan to force out the Japanese invaders and were landing all these supplies, the Navy was coming around all these ships to protect them from the Japanese fleet. And there had been a big battle. And the next day, there was a small group of, they were carrier escorts. So they were small carriers and also destroyers and destroyer escorts. So small destroyers, smaller than regular destroyers, with, basically very, very little armor, if any, because they were meant to be fast, and they're mostly meant to be anti-sub and that sort of thing. No capital ships amongst them, and they run into this fleet, Admiral Corrida's fleet. I think it was Corrida. You'll have to forgive me. I'm reading a book about Corregidor right now, so the names are a little bit mixed up in my head. So the admiral in command of this small American fleet is Admiral Ziggy Sprague, who was married to Fitzgerald's sister. What was that fellow's name? F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was married to F. Scott Fitzgerald's sister. And apparently they didn't see eye to eye, and his sister didn't like him either, or had problems with his lifestyle. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. So this small force of American ships runs into this force of huge Japanese capital ships, cruisers, and the Yamato, which was the largest battleship ever built, and had these gigantic, I think, 18-inch guns, the biggest guns ever put on a battleship. And so these destroyers have to go in against these massive ships that they stand absolutely no chance against, and defend the carriers while they get away, because the carriers are what's very important. And also there are Avenger bombers and I think Wildcat fighters. And it was just a really, really good book, a really good look into this fight, about how, a lot of these guys got into the Navy because they thought it would be safer, it would be cleaner, it would be they would be far removed from the combat and from the horrors of war. And when they go up against these Japanese battleships, I mean, these ships are torn to pieces and beat. But the Japanese were using armor-piercing shells because they mistakenly thought that they were up against regular-sized carriers and uh, American cruisers, armored cruisers. And so they were firing these huge shells, several thousand pounds, and the shells were hitting the destroyers and going straight through them. Just, but they were tearing these ships up, and it's just awful. And James Hornfischer was able to speak to the survivors many years later and hear these awful accounts of men working in compartments below decks, having these huge shells shoot through their compartments, completely through, but cutting steam pipes and scalding everyone in the compartment to death, or men walking out of a compartment and coming back in the next second and everyone in there has been literally blown apart. So it's very gruesome. It goes very far into how awful this was for everyone involved, and these ships had no chance. And I can't remember if they were all sank. I think there were 3 or 4 of them, these destroyers, and I know at least 2 of them were sank. And so, like I said, it's been a couple of weeks since I've read this, so I'm not going to be totally accurate on this. But just awful. They were shot to pieces, and they survived much longer than they had thought they would. I think this battle lasted for 2 hours, and these destroyers, they had 5-inch guns, and that sounds large, but when you're going up against heavily armored capital ships that are meant to take a pounding from 14, 16-inch guns, they just had no chance. So their best they could do was just to keep firing on these larger ships and keep them distracted and keep them away from the carriers until the end. And that's pretty much what they did. And I think Hornfischer did a really, really good job with this book. I was really impressed by it. And let me see if I can find an excerpt here. There was one excerpt that I think really put into perspective what these destroyers were up against. By any measure, the mathematics of the engagement were preposterously against them. The Yamato displaced nearly 70,000 tons. She alone matched almost exactly in weight all 13 ships of Taffy 3. Each of her 3 main gun turrets weighed more than an entire Fletcher-class destroyer. Her armor belts, 16 inches thick at the waterline and more than 2 feet thick on her gun turrets, were impenetrable to an American destroyer's guns. Her 9 18.1-inch rifles were the biggest guns that ever went to sea, firing 3,200-pound shells more than 26 miles. Their development was so secret that even Admiral Kurita did not know their true size. The super battleship's secondary battery of 6 6-inch guns packed twice the hitting power of anything Ziggy Sprague's largest escorts had. The ship was a great gray beast whose bulk pressed down into the ocean and possessed it, displacing enough water to raise measurably the level of a small lake. At flank speed of 27 knots, the Yamato sliced the sea and drew it back around her in a roiling maelstrom, leaving a wake that capsized small boats. The Yamato was not the only ship that completely outgunned Sprague's task unit. The Nagato, displacing 42,850 tons, fielded 8 16-inch guns, and the Congo and her sister ship the Haruna, 36,600 tons, were fast frontline battleships armed with 8-gun, 14-inch batteries. Kurita's 6 heavy cruisers were 35-knot killers that had a cumulative displacement equal to that of the Yamato. Finally, Kurita had 2 flotillas of destroyers, 11 in all, each led by a light cruiser, the Yahagi and the Nashiro, 8,543 tons, with 6-inch batteries. On paper, each of the destroyers matched the Johnston, the Hull, or the Harriman in speed and torpedo power, if not quite in gunnery. The only weapon in Sprague's modest arsenal that Corita could not match was aircraft. Each of the 6 American jeeps carried about 30 planes, but loaded with depth charges, anti-personnel bombs, rockets, and the machine guns in their wings, not to mention the propaganda leaflets they sometimes carried in lieu of more kinetic payloads, they were not armed for attacking heavy surface ships. So that's what they were up against, these little ships. And if Admiral Corita had accurately appraised these ships that he was going up against, they would have stood absolutely no chance and been destroyed almost immediately, because they would have immediately started firing high explosive shells and destroyed them. So it's just that his expectation of seeing large American carriers having a book that didn't have the smaller carriers in it is what made him believe that these ships were large carriers and capital ships. And so his misjudgment there is what allowed this battle to last 2 hours and not 10 minutes. So I don't know, it was just a really good book. And it goes into, after these ships were sank, how the men who survived were cast into the sea and were clinging on to flotsam, basically, and onto nets and things like that, and how it took several days for, I think Admiral Halsey had to send down, and Halsey has been criticized for his handling of this whole episode, had to send ships to find them, and they were attacked by sharks. Some of the men went crazy from, some of them were drinking seawater. Just a really horrific thing that happened to these guys, and it's a really good book. It is The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James D. Hornfischer. Really, really good. I was really impressed by that book. So, next book I read was The Queen, The Life of Elizabeth II by Elizabeth Longford. And there she is on the back. She was the Countess of Longford and the mother of Thomas Pakenham and Antonia Fraser, 2 big names in history. And in fact, their books, I have Thomas Pakenham's book right over here, and Antonia Fraser's books are right in here somewhere, right in this area. I haven't read either of them. I really want to, and I'm glad I read this one. This was really good. I enjoyed it anyway. So this was published in 1982, so it leaves out the last 40 some odd years of Queen Elizabeth's life. And Steve Donahue, last month, I think he intended to do a read-along of Sarah Bradford's book on Queen Elizabeth II. And I couldn't find that book, and so I picked this one up and read it. I also got this last month. I bought this last month, so it could have been in my book haul the other day. And I just really enjoyed this look into the Queen's life, and I thought it was really well done. I'll admit that I skipped one chapter. Not entirely. I read part of it, and I got bored with it, and I skipped it, and it was about horse racing. And I realized that horse racing was extremely important to Queen Elizabeth, but I don't find it interesting at all. And I feel like I read the important parts of it, of her kinship with horses and her love of horse racing and all that. And I think I got, the basic understanding of it, but I didn't really want to read about entering horses into races and breeding them and all that. I just really, I live in central Kentucky. I'm surrounded by horses and horse farms and horse farmers. And, I went to school with kids who acted like they were podunk rednecks, but they lived on multi-million-dollar horse farms. So I've had my fill of horse racing. But anyway, it was just a really good book. So it does only go to 1982. So some of the things that she talks about how Prince Charles found true love with Diana, and this was true love story, and it'll last, and Diana will be queen, and so looking ahead to the future where uh, King Charles and Queen Diana are reigning in peace, and hopefully with um, the virtues of Elizabeth II. So that was a little interesting because I know what happened after that. And, in fact, one of my earliest memories is the death of Princess Diana in, I think, 97. I remember when that happened. And I don't know why that sticks in my mind. I remember it being on the news. I remember the footage there in Paris, and for years and years afterwards, of course, it was on the cover of tabloids. I don't know why that stuck in my mind, but there are a couple of things like that stuck in my mind when I was young. And I don't know if it's just because, princesses aren't supposed to die. I was like 4 or 5 at the time. I think I was 4. So that just stuck in my mind. But I really enjoyed this insight into Elizabeth II, and I thought it was really good. It talks about, her father, George VI, and how he raised her to be queen, and how she really took on the responsibilities of being queen in George's. She inherited a lot of that sense of duty and responsibility from her father and her mother. And I read a great book last year. It was Sarah Bradford's book on George VI, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed this one too. And, that book's falling down here. And the last book I read, and I'm going to talk about in this video, is Nicholas Pileggi's Wiseguy, Life in a Mafia Family. This is the hoodlum saga of Henry Hill. So this is the basis for the movie Goodfellas. This is a true story, though. Or it's as true as it could possibly be, right? We found out some things after this book was published years later about certain aspects of Henry and Karen Hill's lives that were not put into this book. For instance, I'm pretty sure that Henry Hill admitted to doing 2 murders, and Karen Hill was in an affair with Paul Vario, the capo from this Lucchese crime family, which, so Henry Hill grew up in, where was it? I think it was in Brooklyn over there. And he grew up in a poor family, a lot of kids. He was Irish Italian, and he lived across the street from a cab stand that was run by Paul Vario's brother. And he sees these guys and he wants to be part of this thing going on. They wear these clothes and this jewelry, and everybody respects them, and they drive these great big Cadillacs and Lincolns, and he's just amazed by them. And he goes across the street one day when he's like 12 or 13, and he gets a job at the cab stand. And these guys, they just love him because he wants to be like them. He wants to be a part of their life. So they're they immediately take to this kid, and they start teaching him all this stuff, and they let him drive their Cadillacs and park them and stuff like that. And he's working, pretty soon he starts working at, they have these poker games and stuff, and he's running and getting people drinks and getting people sandwiches, and he's starting to know all these guys by name, and they're starting to know him by sight. And so he's almost like their kid in a way. They really, they look out for him and everything, but they're also grooming him for this life of crime. And so from the time that he's 12 until he's in his, I think, early 40s, somewhere in there. So he was born in the early 40s, and then in the late 70s is when he turned state's witness or whatever. And so we get to meet all these people, the Vario brothers, um, Jimmy Burke, who was portrayed by Robert De Niro in the movies, Jimmy Conway, and then Tommy DeSimone, who was, that was Joe Pesci's character. And, you know, what's interesting is that Henry was older in real life than Tommy. And he was about 13 years younger than Jimmy. And so they go for all these scams together, scamming people every single day. That's all they do. They get up in the morning, they scam people all day long, and then they go out at night to clubs and to parties, and they drink and they spend all their money, and they sleep in hotel rooms, and they wake up in the morning and they do it all over again for years and years and years. And it goes into how Henry and Karen met. And if you've ever seen Goodfellas, like the book and the movie are almost exactly alike. There's not too much that's different in the movies. There are a couple of things, but not a lot. And it happened pretty much that way, according to Henry Hill. And yeah, I just really, I've read this book, I think, 3 or 4 times now over the years. I think I read it first when I was like 14, and I read it again when I was still in high school, and I think I've read it a couple of years after that. It's a really engaging narrative, and it goes up to the Lufthansa heist, which was like a $5 million plus heist out of the airport there in New York, which is something like $28 million today, that Jimmy Burke pulled off with Tommy DeSimone. And Jimmy doesn't want to share the money, so he started killing people. And so it goes into like Henry goes to prison at one point for several years, and he has Karen smuggle things in for him, and he's running all these scams in prison, and he starts dealing drugs in prison, and the drugs turn out to be his downfall. But he has to make all this money to keep up his lifestyle in prison, so he's associated with the mafia, but he's not making any money on the streets anymore. But he's got to pay off these guards, he's got to pay for his comforts in prison, and that's how he gets into drugs, and that goes downhill for him, and to the point where Paul Vario cuts him off, and he's on his own. And now, you know, Jimmy is on this warpath, and the next person in his sights is Henry Hill, because Henry is doing drugs, he's dealing drugs, he's been arrested for drugs, and they think he's going to rat, or Jimmy thinks he's going to rat. And so that's why Henry, because Henry knows he's not going to rat. Henry is a hoodlum from the tip of his toes to the top of his head. But he's, you know, his best friend is going to whack him. And he's just not willing to let that happen, just for Jimmy Burke's ego. And so, and I don't know. There's something about this narrative. It's very, the way Henry talks about it, the way Nicholas Pileggi writes about it, is just very compelling and very gripping. It's a really good book. It's a really interesting take on what was going on in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s in the mob in New York City. So, yeah, if you're into that kind of thing, it reads almost like fiction, but it's not. It's true. You know, to the extent that Henry told the truth. So those are the books that I've been reading, and I know that was probably a lot of talking about books, so I might cut this video into 2 parts. Yeah, so, well, I'll say what I am reading right now. I'm also reading The Boats of the Glen Carrig, or Carrig, by William Hope Hodgson. This is really interesting. And Corregidor, The End of the Line, by Eric Morris. This is about the Japanese invasion of the Philippines in 1941, 1942, a subject I don't know very much about. So I'll be talking about those in a video down the line. But I wanted to thank you for watching, and I'd love it if you left a comment and just let me know what's on your mind. And I'll see you next time.